webmaster of Climate and Capitalism, which is a website which is quite well known in ecological circles and is also featured on the Monthly Review webzine site. Ian is the author of, or editor of one book, The Global Fight for Climate Justice, and the author, co-author, of another one, Too Many People, question mark. Question mark is important. And he is, I don't know what your current projects are, but he is one of the, I would say, one of the best informed and clearest, cogent debater in this milieu, and has been doing this for a good many years now. So I think the best thing would be to turn the floor over to Ian, who has an excellent slideshow as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And thank you for coming. Those of you who've been here for the last 15 minutes have watched us wrestle with the technology. That does happen. Climateandcapitalism.com usually works almost every time you log on, so I hope some of you will check it out. We're going to talk about, I want to talk about ecosocialism, which is a word that for most people seems like a neologism, an unusual new word, although in fact it first appeared in German in the 1970s, and the first instance we found of it in English is in 1980. So it's been around close to 40 years. But as a global movement, it's probably in the less than a decade old. The Ecosocialists International Network was actually founded in 2007, and I was involved in that process. And in the last few years, it has started to pick up significantly, especially in Europe, North America, and Australia. So what I want to do is sort of give you some overview of some of the ideas that are involved in ecosocialism, what it's about, and as the title of the talk said, why the reds have to be green and the greens have to be red. 170 years ago, Karl Marx predicted that unless capitalism was eliminated, the great productive forces that it unleashed would turn into destructive forces. And that is exactly what has happened. Every day we see more and more evidence that capitalism, which was once the basis for an unprecedented wave of creativity and liberation, has transformed itself into a force for destruction, decay, and death. It directly threatens the very existence of the human race, not to mention the existence of the millions of species of plants and animals with whom we share this earth. Many people have proposed technological fixes or political reforms to address various parts of this crisis, and many of those measures deserve our serious consideration. Some of them may buy us time, some of them may delay the ecological day of reckoning. Contrary to what you've heard, no serious socialist is opposed to partial measures or reforms. We'll actively support any measure that reduces, limits, or delays the devastating effects of capitalism. And we will work with anyone, socialist or not, who seriously wants to fight for such measures. In fact, just try to stop us. But as socialists, our view is that there can be no lasting solution to the world's multiple economic crises so long as capitalism remains the dominant economic and social system on the planet. Well, we don't claim we have all the answers, but we think we have one big answer. The only basis for long-term, permanent change in the way humanity relates to the rest of nature is an eco-socialist revolution. If we don't make that transformation, we may delay disaster, but disaster will remain inevitable. As the headline on the Climate and Capitalism website has said from the very beginning, our choice is eco-socialism or barbarism. There isn't a third way. But what do we mean by eco-socialism? There is no copyright on the word. And eco-socialism as a global current is quite far from homogeneous. What I'm going to say tonight reflects my own perspective. There are others within the eco-socialist movement. Eco-socialism begins with a critique of its two parents, ecology and Marxism. At its best, 20th century ecology has given us powerful tools for understanding how nature functions. Ecology can and does provide essential insights into the ways that human activity is undermining the very systems that make all forms of life possible. But while ecology has done very well at describing the damage caused by humans, its lack of social analysis means that very few ecologists have come up with anything that resembles a credible program for stopping the destruction. Unlike other animals, the relationship between human beings and our environment can't be simply explained by our numbers or our biology. But that's typically where ecology stops. In fact, when ecologists turn to social questions, they almost always get the answers wrong, because they assume that problems in the relationship between humanity and nature are just a result of ignorance or misunderstanding. All we need to do is tinker with taxes or markets, or maybe advertise birth control a bit better, and everything will be fine. The lack of a coherent critique of capitalism has made most green parties ineffective. Or even worse, it has allowed them to become junior partners in neoliberal governments, providing green camouflage for reactionary policies. And as Naomi Klein shows in her excellent new book, This Changes Everything, many of the biggest green NGOs long ago gave up on actively building an environmental movement, preferring to campaign for donations from the polluters. Because they don't understand capitalism, they think they can solve problems by being friendly with capitalists. In contrast, Marxism's greatest strength is its comprehensive critique of capitalism, an analysis that explains why this specific social order has been both so successful and so destructive. Marxism has shown that another kind of society is both possible and necessary. A society in which destructive capitalist production is replaced by cooperative production, and in which capitalist property is replaced by common shared property. And as John Bellamy Foster and others have shown, what we now call ecology was surprisingly deeply embedded in Marx's thought. As Paul Burkett says in the excellent book Marx and Nature, one of the two I'm going to recommend very highly tonight, Marxism is not an alternative to environmentalism, but a particular kind of environmentalism, one that considers people-nature relations from the standpoint of class relations and human emancipation. Unfortunately, most 20th century Marxists either ignored environmental issues entirely or blithely deferred all consideration of the subject until after the revolution, which would somehow magically solve all our problems. What's worse, some of the worst ecological nightmares of the 20th century occurred in countries that called themselves socialist. You only have to mention the nuclear horror of Chernobyl or the poisoning and draining of the Aral Sea to make clear that eliminating capitalism by itself won't save the world. Now, of course, there's an easy answer to this. We could claim that, well, that wasn't socialism, so we don't even have to discuss that subject. But our critics will treat that as a cop-out, and justly so, because the people in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the other Soviet bloc countries thought they were building socialism. And for most people worldwide, that was what socialism looked like. So whether we call those countries socialist or something else, we need to answer the question that underlies that, which is what makes us think that the next attempts to build socialist societies will do any better than those did? Well, that's a critical question we have to be able to answer. And our answer has two parts. The first is that eliminating profit and accumulation as the driving forces of the economy will eliminate capitalism's innate drive to pollute and destroy. While mistaken policies and ignorance have caused some pollution and ecological destruction, the global crisis we face today isn't the result of mistakes. It's the inevitable way the result of the way capitalism works, a system under which profit is really the only ultimate measure of whether an activity is appropriate. With capitalism, an ecologically balanced world is impossible. Socialism doesn't make it certain, but for the first time in centuries, it will be possible. As Eric Olin Wright says, socialism is a terrain for working for social and political justice, not a guarantee for achieving those ideals. So that's the first part of our answer. The second part of our answer is that history isn't made by impersonal forces. The transition to socialism will be achieved by real people, and real people can learn from experience. The lesson we need to learn from the environmental failures of socialism in the 20th century is that ecology must have a central place in socialist theory, in the socialist program, and in the activity of the socialist movement. Not just in the future, but today, as an essential part of the fight for socialism. That's what ecosocialism aims to be and aims to do. Ecosocialism aims to build a society that has two fundamental and indivisible characteristics. And in fact, I saw a nice line in a book by Samir Amin recently where he says, we shouldn't really say this is a society we're going to build because it's going to be built by future generations. What we hope to do is to contribute to building it as well as we can, given the knowledge and ability we have. The society will be socialist, contributed to democracy, to radical egalitarianism, and social justice. It would be based on collective ownership of the means of production, and it will work actively to eliminate exploitation, profit, and accumulation as the driving forces of our economy. And it will be based on the best ecological principles, given top priority to stopping anti-environmental practices, to restoring damaged ecosystems, and to reestablishing agriculture and industry on ecologically sound principles. There's a sentence in John Bellamy Foster's book, The Ecological Rift, that precisely and concisely defines ecosocialism. There can be no true ecological revolution that is not socialist, and no true socialist revolution that is not ecological. When we say ecosocialist revolution, we are talking about a profound change in the way humans relate to the earth, in how we produce and reproduce, and in almost everything humans do and how we do it. What we're aiming for is not just a small reorganization, but what Fred Magdoff, writing in Monthly Review, calls a truly ecological civilization, one that exists in harmony with natural systems. Fred listed 8 characteristics that he thought such a civilization would have. It would, number 1, stop growing when basic human needs are met, not grow for the sake of growth. Would not entice people to consume more and more. Protect natural life support systems and respect the limits to natural resources, taking into account the needs of future generations. It would make decisions based on long-term societal ecological needs while not neglecting the short-term needs of people. It would run as much as possible on current, including recent past, energy instead of on fossil fuels. Would foster the human characteristics and a culture of cooperation, sharing, reciprocity, and responsibility to neighbors and community. It would make possible the full development of the human potential, and it would develop truly democratic political and economic decision-making for local, regional, and multi-regional needs. Fred says, a society with those characteristics would be essentially the opposite of capitalism in essentially all respects. Achieving such a change is absolutely essential, but we shouldn't delude ourselves that it will happen simply or quickly. In fact, I have found that most environmentalists and socialists seriously underestimate just how big the change will have to be, how difficult it will be, and how long it will take to carry it through. In 1971, 40 years ago, Barry Commoner, one of the first modern socialists to write about the environmental crisis, estimated that in order to reverse the environmental destruction that he saw in the United States alone, to rebuild industry and agriculture on an ecologically sound basis, he said, most of the nation's resources for capital investment would need to be engaged in the task of ecological reconstruction for at least a generation. Now, that was in 1971. And the rate and extent of ecological environmental destruction has accelerated rapidly in the decades since. The time required and the cost of the repairs and reconstruction have increased substantially. For example, the United Nations recently estimated that it will take 30 years to clean up the devastating damage caused by Shell oil in the Ogoni people's homeland in the Niger Delta. That's an area of just 386 square miles, 30 years. Now, the Niger Delta is a particularly horrible example of ecocide, but there are many more examples in the world, enough to dash any hope that this would be an easy turnaround. In addition to a great deal of hard, practical work, the transformation will undoubtedly require new knowledge and new science. To paraphrase Marx, there is no recipe book for the chefs of the ecological revolution. What we can deal with now, and what we can and must discuss now, is how are we going to get to the starting point, because we're not there yet. One of the pioneers of revolutionary socialism and environmentalism, the great British poet and artist William Morris, writing at the end of the 19th century, described the starting point this way. The first real victory of the social revolution, he said, will be the establishment not indeed of a complete system of communism in a day, which is absurd, but of a revolutionary administration whose definite and conscious aim will be to prepare and further in all available ways human life for such a system. We combine William Morris's words with Fred Magdoff's words, we could summarize the central goal of the eco-socialist movement today as a revolutionary administration whose definite and conscious aim will be to prepare and further in all available ways human life for an ecological civilization. In the book that Simon Butler and I wrote, which Richard pointed out, Too Many People, Simon and I expressed that same idea this way. In every country, we need governments that break with the existing order, that are answerable only to working people, farmers, the poor, indigenous communities, and immigrants. In a word, to the victims of ecocidal capitalism, not its beneficiaries and representatives. And we suggested some first measures that such governments might take. Our suggestions, and they're not written in stone, include rapidly phasing out fossil fuels and biofuels, replacing them with clean energy, actively supporting farmers to convert to ecological agriculture, defending local food production and distribution, introducing free and efficient public transport networks, restructuring existing extraction, production, and distribution systems to eliminate waste, planned obsolescence, pollution, and manipulative advertising, and providing full retraining to all affected workers and communities. Retrofitting existing homes and buildings for energy efficiency, closing down all military operations at home and abroad, and transforming the armed forces into voluntary teams charged with restoring ecosystems and assisting the victims of environmental disasters. As I say, those aren't carved in stone, and I'm sure everybody here could think of other very important changes we need to make. And I should stress that we shouldn't wait, and we cannot wait, for an eco-socialist government to do this. On the contrary, we should be fighting for every one of these things today as central elements of our fight for a better world. These are just the first steps, just the beginning. Building a full ecological civilization will involve much more. But the longer it takes us to build a movement that can get the process started, the longer and more difficult the eco-socialist revolution will be. Now, I've stressed the complexity and size of this task, not to discourage you, and I hope I didn't, but to underline another essential point. Good ideas aren't enough. Moral authority isn't enough. An eco-socialist revolution cannot be made by a minority. It can't be imposed by politicians and bureaucrats, no matter how well-meaning they might be. It would require the active participation of the great majority of the people. In Marx's famous words, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves. Now, this isn't just every once in a while, these things just don't change at the speed I want them to. Can we throw it? Oh, there we go. Okay. No, that's backwards.
Is that okay?
No, let's go forward.
You have to go forward.
Okay.
There we are. It isn't just because democracy is morally superior, but because the necessary changes cannot be carried through and will not be long-lasting unless they are actively supported, created, and implemented by the broadest possible range of people. Only majority support can possibly overcome the opponents of change. The only way to overcome the forces that now rule, the forces of global destruction, is to organize a countervailing force that can stop them and remove them from power. Because there's a fundamental truth about revolutions. There is no such thing as a win-win revolution, where everybody gains and nobody loses. In a real revolution, in a real transformation, the people who had power and privileges in the old society lose their power and privileges in the new. Now, a few of those people may join the cause, and of course we'd welcome them, but most probably won't. Today, as in every human society for thousands of years, there are powerful social groups that benefit from the existing situation, and they will resist change no matter how obvious the need for change is. We only have to look to our current government, or the US Congress, or the Koch brothers, to see powerful people who will resist change even to the point of destroying the world they live in. Because the climate change denial industry is not a bunch of cranks. They are well-financed politicians backed by some of the world's richest corporations, and they're willing to bring the world down to protect their power, as arbitrary and absurd as that seems. You know, whenever we talk about a revolution, somebody accuses us of fomenting violence. In fact, most of the eco-socialists I know are actually pretty nonviolent in their personal lives. Now, I'll admit that some of us have interesting tastes in sports, but that doesn't necessarily translate into our political outlook. We don't want violence, and we will be pleased if the transition is entirely peaceful. Unfortunately, unlike in professional sports, what happens in a revolution isn't entirely up to us. As we've seen in many countries, the democratic election of popular governments by huge majorities has never stopped defenders of the old order from trying to regain power through violent means. And as the people of Venezuela and Bolivia and many other countries have shown, the best way to minimize and counteract the violence of the reactionaries is to mobilize the largest possible number of people to defend the changes that we believe are necessary. What forces will determine the outcome of this global environmental crisis? Which way will it go? 5 years ago, we had a very strong foretaste of the lineup of forces on each side. Call it a tale of two cities. The first city was Copenhagen in December 2009, when the world expected a climate deal. The optimism was enormous. The world's richest countries sent delegations to Copenhagen with instructions not to save the climate, but to block any action that might weaken their home economies or harm their competitive position in world markets. And they succeeded. The backroom deal that became known as the Copenhagen Accord was, as Fidel Castro commented at the time, nothing but a joke. Or as Hugo Chavez said at the time, if the climate had been a bank, they would have saved it. The follow-up deal they negotiated in Cancun was no better. The Copenhagen Agreement, if there's one thing we can learn from that and all of the other UN meetings to decide what to do, or actually to not decide what to do, it is that our rulers do not want to solve the climate and ecological crisis. Period. They place their narrow economic and electoral interests before the survival of humanity. They will not change course willingly. And then there was another city. 5 months after the Copenhagen meeting, a very different meeting took place in Cochabamba in Bolivia. At the invitation of Bolivian President Evo Morales, some 35,000 people, the great majority of them indigenous people, came from 130 countries to do what Obama and his allies refused to do in Copenhagen, to develop a program to save the Earth. They drafted a people's agreement that places responsibility for the climate crisis on the capitalist system and on the rich countries that have a, quote, have a carbon footprint 5 times larger than the planet can bear. In all, the World People's Conference adopted some 18 major statements covering topics from climate refugees to indigenous rights to technology transfer and more. It's just impossible to imagine such a program coming out of any meeting of the wealthy powers, or in fact out of any United Nations conference. Those two meetings in Copenhagen and Cochabamba symbolize the great divide in the struggle for the future of the Earth and humanity. On one side, a meeting dominated by the rich and powerful, determined to save their wealth and privilege even if the world burns. On the other side, indigenous people, small farmers and peasants, working women, progressive activists, working people of all kinds, determined to save the world from the rich and powerful. The Cochabamba Conference was a big step towards a global movement that can actually change the world. It showed in a very preliminary way the alliance of forces that must be forged in each country and internationally to end the environmentally destructive capitalist system. We need students and academics and feminists and scientists. Those are all vital to this movement. But we won't change the world unless we win the active participation of working people and farmers and indigenous people and all of the oppressed. These are the forces that the Green Left must ally with. These are the forces that we must win to the perspective of eco-socialist revolution. Now, at this point, you should be asking, that's right, you should be asking yourself, well, that's all very well. But how do we build that alliance? How do we win mass support for our program and our objectives? And that's exactly the right question to ask. It's all very well to have a solid analysis and a good, even brilliant program. My home bookshelves are full to overflowing with books, with people analyzing what's wrong and offering all kinds of valuable solutions. But if we can't translate those ideas into action, then the ideas are irrelevant, and so are we. To cite another famous comment by Marx, our task is not just to explain the world, but to change it. That's how socialists approach this kind of thing. We use our analysis of the world as a basis for determining what we do. First we ask what is going on, and then we ask what is to be done. And when we ask that question today, we need to be intensely aware of the fact that although a need for revolutionary change is clear to us, we are a tiny minority, not just in society at large, but even within the environmental movement. As the Marxist scholar Frederick Jameson has said, we live in a time when for most people, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Most green activists don't see capitalism as the primary problem. Or if they do, they don't believe that socialism is possible or desirable as a solution. So the task before us is not to proclaim the revolution from every street corner. Those who've been around for the left know a lot of us have done that for many years. But rather, our task is to find ways to work with the broadest possible range of people as they are today. The Latin American Marxist Marta Harnacker has expressed it this way: being radical is not a matter of advancing the most radical slogans, she said, or of carrying out the most radical actions. Being radical lies rather in creating spaces where broad sectors can come together and struggle. For as human beings, we grow and transform ourselves in the struggle. Understanding that we are many and that we are fighting for the same objectives is what makes us strong and radicalize us. What she's done there is she's restated actually what Marx said in another context, which can be paraphrased as, we don't change ourselves and then change the world, we change ourselves by changing the world. And that's the kind of process we're talking about. Involving people in that process of changing the world is what will change them. We can't artificially create majority support. Fortunately, we can depend on capitalism and imperialism to do it for us. Marx and Angus said it a long time ago, what the bourgeoisie produces above all are its own gravediggers. Now we can't tell in advance when or exactly how that will happen, where struggles will break out, or what the critical issues might be. But it will happen. It happens again and again. The real question is, will the next upsurge peter out, or will it be defeated, or will it move forward and ultimately challenge the system itself? There are no guarantees. Contrary to what you might hear from critics, Marxism is not a deterministic philosophy. We do not believe that socialism is inevitable, that it will simply happen by some amazing process. But as long ago as 1848, Marx and Angus posed an alternative. The class struggle would lead either to a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or to the common ruin of the contending classes. They were looking back to experiences like the collapse of the Roman Empire. But we can in our time say, the common ruin of all, the destruction of civilization, is a very real possibility in this century. And the key, the alternative to it, is building a movement to change direction. Other factors will, one factor that will determine the outcome, in fact, what may be the single most important factor, is the role that will be played by people in this room and others like you around the world. Spontaneous uprisings, we see them almost weekly, it seems sometimes monthly, around the world, one place or another. But they are not by themselves sufficient to bring into being, back to our previous mixed quote of Morris and Magdoff, a revolutionary administration whose definite and conscious aim will be to prepare and further in all available ways human life for an ecological civilization. That will not be achieved unless we are successful in creating, in advance, an organized movement with a clear vision, an eco-socialist program that can bridge the gap between the spontaneous anger of millions of people and the beginnings of the radical transformation that we need. We need to slow capitalism's ecocidal drive as much as possible and reverse it where we can, to win every possible victory over the forces of destruction. I was listening to two people argue the other day. One is a longtime socialist, the other one was also a socialist, but rather new at it. And he was arguing, well, only socialism is the only solution, so that's all we should fight for. And my friend, who's even makes me look young, said, how can you imagine you're going to bring about a revolution if you can't actually win anything now? If you can't win anything, you cannot win total transformation. So we need to win every possible victory. Our rulers will not willingly change, but mass opposition can force them to act even against their will. There are many environmental issues in the world today, and I'm sure eco-socialists will be active in a wide variety of campaigns, but the scope and potential destructiveness of the climate emergency makes it the most important issue, and we need to give it our highest priority. And our goal must be to bring together everyone, socialists, liberals, deep greens, trade unionists, feminists, indigenous activists, and more. Everyone is willing to demand that governments act decisively to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we need to unite the forces that understand the need to go beyond defensive battles and lay the basis for a movement that can in fact initiate an eco-socialist revolution. Fortunately, those two tasks aren't in conflict. Fighting for immediate gains against capitalist destruction and fighting for the eco-socialist future aren't separate activities, they are aspects of one common process. Because it's through united struggles for immediate gains and environmental reforms that working people and farmers and indigenous people can build the organizations and the collective knowledge they need to defend themselves and advance their interests. The victories they win in partial struggles help to build the confidence needed to take on bigger targets. And it's only by participating in and building such struggles that eco-socialists can win, and the eco-socialist movement can grow, can win a hearing from wider numbers of people, and ultimately build the movement we need. The People's Agreement adopted in Cochabamba eloquently expresses the challenge before us. Humanity confronts a great dilemma: to continue on the path of capitalism, depredation, and death, or to choose the path of harmony with nature and respect for life. It is imperative that we forge a new system that restores harmony with nature and among human beings. For there to be balance with nature, there must first be equity among human beings. That, in 3 sentences, is the case for building a movement to save the world. the case for an eco-socialist revolution. As I've said, it won't be easy, but I can't think of a more important and worthwhile cause. By working together, we can put an end to capitalism before it puts an end to us.